Wet your hands with water. Apply soap, rub your hands palm to palm, and wash the backs of both hands and in between your fingers. Then palm to palm with fingers interlocked. Clasp your hands together and rub, and then clean around the thumbs too. Rub your fingertips in the palms of your hands and finish off with the wrists. Rinse your hands really well with water and dry them thoroughly with a paper towel. Use the towel to turn off the tap. Your hands are now clean.
Good morning, students. This is Kulrez Azizi. I hope you're doing well. Today we're going to start new chapter, Weathering the Storm in Ersama. That's chapter number 6 from your English book, Moments. It's about a cyclone that hit Orissa in October 1999 and killed thousands of people and devastated hundreds of villages. It's written by an Indian writer, Harsh Mandar. I'll just read the paragraphs for you and take you further. On 27 October 1999, 7 years after his mother's death, Prashant had gone to the block headquarters of Ersama, a small town in coastal Orissa, some 18 kilometers from his village, to spend the day with a friend. So the date was 27th October 1999, and his mother had died 7 years ago. Whose mother? So the main character here is Prashant, whose mother was died 7 years ago. And he went to see one of his friends in a small town called Ersama. That's the coastal area of Orissa, and it was somewhere 18 kilometers from his village. In the evening, a dark and menacing storm quickly gathered. So that evening, when he was there, the cyclone came. The dark and menacing, dangerous storm quickly gathered. So suddenly it started. Winds beat against the houses with a speed and fury that Prashant had never witnessed before. And the strong winds started blowing. That was quite furious. And the speed and fury, what Prashant saw, he had never seen that before in his life. Heavy and incessant rain filled the darkness. Heavy and incessant, the continuous. So when the cyclone hit that place, heavy and continuous rain filled the darkness. Ancient trees were uprooted and crashed to the earth. Ancient old trees, they were uprooted, means they were broken and fallen on the ground. Screams rent the air as people and houses were swiftly washed away. Screams, the sound, the crying sound of people, rent means filled. So the air was filled with the screaming of the people because their houses were swiftly washed away. The angry water swirled into his friend's house neck deep. And because it was raining heavily, so soon his friend's house was filled with water, and it was neck deep. The building was of brick and mortar and was strong enough to survive the devastation of the wind's velocity of 350 km/h. because his friend's house was built of brick and mortar. These are the materials what they use to build a house. It was strong enough to face this kind of destruction. The wind's velocity was 350 kilometer per hour, means the speed of that wind was 350 kilometer per hour. But the cold terror of the family grew with the crashing of trees that had got uprooted and fallen on their house sometime in the middle of the night, damaging its roof and walls. So the house was strong enough to face the storm, but because of that storm, the trees were uprooted and they were falling. So somewhere in the middle of the night, some trees also fallen on their house, and that damaged its roof and walls. The crazy destruction wrought by the cyclone and the surge of the ocean continued for the next 36 hours, although wind speeds had reduced somewhat by the next morning. So the situation was like the same for next 36 hours, and but by next morning the wind speed was reduced. To escape the waters rising in the house, Prashant and his friend's family had taken refuge on the roof. And because the house was filled with the water, and so to escape from that thing, uh, Prashant and his friend's family had taken shelter on the rooftop, on the roof of that house. Prashant will never forget the shock he experienced at his first glimpse of the devastation wrought by the super cyclone in the grey light of the early morning. And Prashant, when he saw the things in the morning, the scene he would never forget when he looked suddenly the destructions caused by the super cyclone. A ragging, deadly brown sheet of water covered everything as far as the eye could see. Ragging means furious. So, a furious, deadly brown sheet of water. Brown sheet of water because the water which was everywhere, it was obviously mixed with muds and things, the remains of the houses and the leaves and so many things. So the watercolor had become brown and it was looking like a brown sheet. So wherever saw, he saw the brown sheet, like the water everywhere, and only fractured cement houses still stood in few places. So all the area was obviously like damaged, and only some houses remains were still stood. Remains like the broken houses were still stood in few places. Bloated animal carcasses and human corpses floated in every direction. So everywhere there were bloated animal carcasses. Bloated animal carcasses means, bloated means swollen. So when obviously animal or even human died in the water, so the body gets swallowed. So the swallowed bloated animal carcasses, the dead bodies, the and human corpses floated in every direction. So everywhere, wherever an eye could see, there were, like destruction everywhere. bloated animal carcasses and human corpses. The dead bodies of human were everywhere. All round, even huge old trees had fallen, and everywhere also you could see the broken, uprooted trees. Two coconut trees had fallen on the roof of their house. This was a blessing in disguise because the tender coconuts from the trees kept the trapped family from starving in the several days that followed. So everywhere the same scene was, and the two coconut trees were also uprooted and fallen on their roof where Prashant and his friend's family were sitting. And it was like blessing in disguise. Blessing means like it wasn't bad that time for them because the fruit of the coconut uh, it kept them from like starving, so they basically eaten those tendered coconut fruits for several days. 2 days Prashant sat huddled with his friend's family in the open on the rooftop. So nearly 2 days Prashant had been sitting with his friend's family. Huddled means like all together kind of a crowd. So basically they all were sitting together in one place and they were sitting on the rooftop. They froze in the cold and incessant rain. The rainwater washed away Prashant's tears. Because they were sitting in an open area on the roof of that house, so it was very cold, and they were also facing continuous rain, and the rainwater had washed away Prashant's tears, so he was not crying anymore. The only thought that flashed through his mind was whether his family had survived the fury of this super cyclone. Was he to be bereaved once again? And all the time, he was just thinking about his family back in his village, and he was thinking whether they had survived or not in the super cyclone. And the bad thought was also coming in his mind. Was he going to bereave once again? Bereave means like somebody's close family member died. So the separation of that person is called bereaved. So that thought was coming all the time in his mind. 2 days later, which seemed to Prashant like 2 years, the rain ceased and the rainwater slowly began to recede. 2 days later, and that 2 days seemed like 2 years for Prashant. And now the rain had stopped and the rain waters slowly began to recede. Recede means like moving forward from one place to another. That means here obviously the water is started receding, started passing. And Prashant was determined to seek out his family without further delay. So 2 days later, he decided to go and find his family without any further delay. But the situation was still dangerous, and his friend's family pleaded with Prashant to stay back a little while longer. But Prashant knew he had to go. So he had already decided that he should go and find his family, and but the situation is still dangerous, and his friend's family they requested him a lot to stay back for some more days. But Prashant had already determined to leave. He equipped himself with a long, sturdy stick and then started on his 18-kilometer expedition back to his village through the swollen flood waters. So he prepared himself. He equipped himself with a long, sturdy stick, a solid stick, like which cannot be bent easily. And then he started his 18 kilometers journey back to his village. It was a journey he would never forget, and that journey Prashant would never forget. He constantly had to use his stick to locate the road. So now you know why he had taken that stick. So he was basically checking the water level with that stick to determine where the water was most shallow. So he was basically checking where the water level was like most shallow, so he could walk along. At places, it was waist deep and progress was slow. So at some places, the water level was like waist deep. So it was deep like your waist level. And obviously, when the water is so deep, then obviously you can't walk properly. So the progress was slow. He was walking slowly. At several points, he lost the road and had to swim. And so at several points, he had lost the road, means the water was so deep that he could not find the road. So he had to swim. After some distance, he was relieved to find two friends of his uncle who were also returning to their village. And moving forward, what he found that two known people who were friends of his uncle, they were also going to the same village. They decided to move ahead together. So they all decided that they should walk together.
As they waded through the waters, the scenes they witnessed grew more and more macabre. Macabre means horrible. So, like I said earlier, when he found two men who were friends of his uncle and they decided to move together. So, as they waded means like walk with difficulty, means obviously when you're walking in a water liquid, obviously you cannot walk freely. So it kind of like swimming or walking in the water. So as they waded through the waters, the scenes they witnessed, the scenes they saw, and they were more horrible. They had to push away many human bodies, men, women, children, and carcasses of dogs, goats, and cattle that the current swept against them as they moved ahead. So, when they were moving forward, they were walking through the water, so they had to push the dead bodies of human and carcasses of dogs, goats, cattle. Cattle means like buffaloes, cows, and so they had to move them. They have to move them to make their way to move forward. In every village that they passed, they could barely see a house standing. So wherever they went through, they went through the villages they were crossing. So hardly they could see any house standing. So meaning most of the houses were broken and fallen. Prashant now wept out loud and long. He was sure that his family could not have survived this catastrophe. catastrophe, like disaster. So, seeing all these things, what Prashant thought that surely his family would have not survived in this disaster. Eventually, Prashant reached his village, Kalikuda. That's the name of his village, Kalikuda. His heart went cold. Where their home once stood, there were only remnants of its roof. So when he reached to his village, what he saw, where his house was built, or where his house was standing, there were only remnants, the remainings of the house, the building. Some of their belongings were caught, mangled, and twisted in the branches of trees just visible above the dark water. So now you could imagine the water was so deep that some of their belongings of his family were caught, mangled, means like they were like twisted in the branches of the trees which were nearby, and that could be seen above the dark waters. Young Prashant decided to go to the Red Cross shelter to look for his family. Red Cross shelter, that's the an agency who does help in this kind of disaster. So Prashant decided to go to their camp to look for his family. Among the first people he saw in the crowd was his maternal grandmother. So when he reached to the Red Cross Society, who he saw, the first person he saw, who was his maternal grandmother. Weak with hunger, she rushed to him, her hands outstretched, her eyes brimming. It was a miracle. They had long given him up for dead. So, brimming, like full of something. So, here it means her maternal grandmother's eyes were full of tears. So, as soon as she saw Prashant, she just rushed to him, she reached to him, and it was a miracle for her because they had given the hope of Prashant. They had thought that he would have died. Quickly, word spread, and his extended family gathered around him and hugged him tight in relief. So, when the maternal grandmother found Prashant, and obviously that news spread it everywhere, and his family, they just gathered around him and they hugged him tight in relief. And Prashant anxiously scanned the mortally. Mortally means the people who were like living bodies, living people who are alive. So he just anxiously scanned or looked through his eyes that who were alive and who were there. Battered crew, his brother and sister, his uncles and aunts, they all seems to be there. So luckily everybody was there, all of his family were there. By the next morning, as he took in the desperate situation in the shelter, he decided to get a grip over himself. So now he had found his family. So next morning, when he just went through the situation in the shelter, and he convinced himself. So basically getting a grip over himself means like he controlled himself, he convinced himself to be strong. He sensed a deathly grief settling upon the 2,500 strong crowd in the shelter. So when he went through all the crowd, the people in that shelter, so what he found that nearly there were 2,500 strong crowd, means like the people were there in that shelter. 86 lives were lost in the village. So he got that news that nearly 86 people had died of his village. All the 96 houses had been washed away, and all the houses, which were nearly 96 houses in that village, and they were just vanished, they were washed away by the water. It was their fourth day at the shelter. So now obviously it was nearly fourth day at that Red Cross Society shelter where they were staying, Prashant and his family and other people of his village and other villages. So far they had survived on green coconuts, but they were too few to go around such a tumult of people. Tumult is like uproar of a disorderly crowd force, means like obviously there were too much crowd, there were so many people and less food. So that's what it means here. So here it says that they had survived on green coconuts. So all they were eating is coconut fruit, green coconut fruit. And but there were so many people around, and obviously the food was less, and obviously you cannot just depend on green coconuts. Prashant, all of 19 years, decided to step in as leader of his village if no one else did. So after these days, after these so many days, so what Prashant decided to lead the crowd, lead the people of his village, and he was just 19 years old. He organized a group of youths and elders to jointly pressurize the merchant once again to part with his rice. So first step he took, that he organized a group of youth, young people and elders, and so their aim was to pressurize the merchant once again to part with his rice. This time the delegation succeeded and returned triumphantly, wading through the receding waters with food for the entire shelter. So they succeeded in their attempt, and triumphantly is like triumphantly, victoriously, means they obviously won that attempt, whatever they tried. So they were succeeded. Delegation means the entire group. So they wading through the receding waters with food for the entire shelter. So they returned with the food for the entire shelter, all the people who were living there in the shelter. No one cared that the rice was already rotting, and rotting means like obviously it rot means I'm sure that when things become useless or not eatable, so that's called rotting. I'm sure you know that word, like sadhana. So they were not bothered. The entire group was not bothered about that rice, because it was already rotting. And rotting, why it's rotten? Obviously, the rice must have been lying in the water. So when they rise or any other things like kanak, you know, if they are lying in the water, obviously they start getting rotting. Branches from fallen trees were gathered to light a reluctant and slow fire on which to cook the rice. And so what they did, they collected the broken branches of the tree, and so they cooked the rice, the food, on using that those branches. They burn the branches and they cook their food. For the first time in 4 days, the survivors at the cyclone shelter were able to fill their bellies. Bellies, like the stomach. Okay, so this was the first time in 4 days of staying in that shelter. Whoever the survivors, whoever was saved in that disaster, the cyclone, so they eaten food. His next task was to organize a team of youth volunteers to clean the shelter of filth, urine, vomit, and floating carcasses, and to tend to the wounds and fractures of the many who had been injured. So the next task, the next work for Prashant and his team was to clean the obviously it was dirty everywhere. There were people were urine of human being and animals, and people were also not well, sick. They were sick, so they were vomiting, so they were vomit, and also they were floating carcasses, the dead bodies of the animals and human also. And they also tried to fix the fractures of those people who were injured, and they did treatment to the wounds of people who were already injured in that shelter. On the 5th day, a military helicopter flew over the shelter and dropped some food parcels. So on 5th day, when they were staying in the shelter, a military helicopter which were dropping food for the people who were in the shelter, that flew over to that shelter and they dropped some food parcels. It then did not return, but after dropping those parcels that day, they did not return, they did not come back again next day or next to next day. The youth task force gathered empty utensils from the shelter, and so what they did, the youth, the young people, the young people in that shelter, they collected empty utensils like pots and pans from the shelter. Then they deputed 2 children to lie in the sand left by the waters around the shelter with these utensils on their stomachs to communicate to the passing helicopters that they were hungry. So what they did, if you can look at this picture, so what they did, they tied up those, they put the basically utensils on the children's stomach. So they laid down on the sand, which was now like the water had passed, so there was some sand in that area. So they laid down there, they put utensils on their stomach so that the passing helicopters could see them and they could understand that they were hungry. The message got through, and after that the helicopter made regular rounds of the shelter, airdropping food and other basic needs. So they were succeeded in that attempt. So the helicopter, which were passing through, they saw these kind of activities, and they understood that the children, the people were hungry. So they dropped food and other basic needs from that day regularly. Prashant found that a large number of children had been orphaned. He brought them together and put up a polythene sheet shelter for them. Women were mobilized to look after them while the men secured food and materials for the shelter. So when Prashant found that there were so many children who had been orphaned because their parents had died, so he and his team made another shelter with help of polythene sheet, and the women were mobilized. The women were organized, or they were instructed to look after those children, and the men had to what they were supposed to do. They were supposed to secure food and other materials for that shelter where these children were living, the orphan children. As the weeks passed, Prashant was quick to recognize that the women and children were sinking deeper and deeper in their grief. He persuaded the women to start working in the food for work program started by an NGO. And for the children, he organized sports events. So in that shelter where the women were supposed to look after the children, and the children obviously very small, they were orphaned. So what he realized, what he found, that they were going into depression. So what he did, he organized work for women that was through an NGO. An NGO stands for non-government organization. So basically most of the NGOs, they help in several sectors like education and establishing like a women workforce, those kind of things. So he did that through an NGO, and he organized sports events for those children. He himself loved to play cricket, and so he organized cricket matches for children. Prashant engaged with other volunteers in helping the widows and children to pick up the broken pieces of their lives. So Prashant and with his volunteers team, they started helping the widows, obviously, who had lost their husbands, and the children who had lost their parents, to they tried to reorganize everything for them. The initial government plan was to set up institutions for orphans and widows. However, this step was successfully resisted, and as it was felt that in such institutions children would grow up without love, and widows would suffer from stigma and loneliness. So obviously the government had planned that they were going to set up something for widows, and some institutions for the children, the orphan children. But these people, Prashant and his team and other people, they resisted on that. They objected on that because they gave their views that the children would grow up without love. Obviously, if they living without parents, so they will not have feeling. They will feel differently, and the same with the widows. They will feel loneliness if they live all alone. So Prashant's group believed orphans should be resettled in their own community itself, possibly in new foster families made up of childless widows and children without adult care. So basically Prashant's group believed their effort was to bring them together. So the widows who had lost their husbands or any other family member, they could adopt the children, and the children could live with them together. as a community. It is 6 months after the devastation of the super cyclone. This time Prashant's wounded spirit has healed simply because he had no time to bother about his own pain. So now the 6 months have passed since the cyclone hit that area. So after that destruction, now Prashant had his wounded spirit. His wounded spirit means like because he was not having extra time for other things or to think about himself. It had been already healed by itself. So he had no pain for himself because he had no time for this, because he had been just working to resettling all these people who had lost their families, the children, orphan children, the widows, and other people. His handsome, youthful face is what the widows and orphan children of his village seek out most in their darkest hour of grief. So this is what he did. This is what he had been doing. So he had no time for himself. That was it. And don't forget that this was written by an Indian writer, Harsh Mandal. I hope you understood well. Thank you very much.